Okay, so it's good morning. It's a pleasure and honor for me to introduce to you today Dan Banik, who is professor of political science and the academic director of Circle U Alliance, the Circle U Alliance Democracy Hub. And Professor Banik is also the director of the Oslo SDG initiative, the Center for Development and the Environment of the University of Oslo. And he is also affiliate professor at the Faculty of Medicine in Oslo, the Center for Sustainable Healthcare. Professor, good morning. What you can have a seat. We have started. Professor Banik is very practical. Okay, so good morning. So I was introduced in Professor Banik, our guest today, who is the director of the Democracy Hub, Circle U. And I was saying, please have a seat. I was saying that Professor Banik has researched extensively on sustainable development, and his books include Political Transition, Poverty, and Inclusive Development in Malawi. And he also has written a book entitled Poverty and Inclusive Development. He also researched extensively on sustainable development in India, and has been visiting professor in many prestigious institutions, including Stanford University, Beijing University, and Tokyo. So, and last but not least, he is also the coordinator, the host of a podcast whose name is In Pursuit of Development, with listeners in 160 countries. So it's a podcast I highly recommend because it's targeted also to a non-expert audience. So it's very today he will talk to us about the role of governments in shaping sustainable political landscape. I think that he also will introduce Circle U. I think that all of you are aware of what Circle U is, but this is an opportunity also to be in touch with the coordinator of the Democracy Hub, and it's an opportunity to discover the many possibilities that the Alliance offers to all of us, students, professors, and to know better this Alliance, especially now that the summer school are starting. And so we have many projects for the forthcoming months. So I don't want to take money. I don't want to take time. And I give the floor to Professor Banik, and I thank him very much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, buongiorno. It's wonderful to be in Pisa. Thank you so much for the sun and the beautiful food. This is my second trip to Pisa, and I just love coming back here. Thank you, Professor Spratti, for your introduction. I am a professor, a regular, ordinary professor of political science at the University of Oslo, but I also am the academic director of Democracy Hub in Circle U, as was introduced, and I'll talk a bit more about Circle U and some of the opportunities that Circle U offers to postdocs, to doctoral students, but also to master's students, bachelor students, and also academic senior researchers. So today, as you will see, and I'll show you some slides, my topic is about something that should concern us all. And that is, changing climate, global warming. We are worried about agriculture, food production. We are worried about emission levels increasing. Some of our students are talking about flight shaming. We should not be flying that much. We should not be eating red meat. I've been eating a lot of red meat in Italy. We should be maybe having much more of a varied diet because our world is changing. And if you're aware of this term sustainable development that became rather popular in the 1990s, it talked quite a lot about, and I can change the slides when we are ready, Angeletta. I wanted to show you the definition of sustainable development, which in a way actually shows some of the problems that we are facing today. Okay, sorry. Yeah, we'll figure it out. I actually don't use PowerPoints, but I thought for you, I wanted to show you some pictures. But just bear with me. Sustainable development, the definition is about making sure our needs, that's the video that was coming later on. That's actually something, that's an argument I'm going to make. Sustainable development is about meeting the needs of the current generation without compromising the needs of future generations, right? To meet their needs. But this itself, yeah, I can just maybe press the first button. There you go. See? Yeah, that's funny. No, not working. There. Oh, it's going too quickly. Yeah, there you go. So that is the definition. That, in my view, my argument is that this is becoming problematic because we think sustainability, and I'm sure even in Italy, there's a lot of talk about sustainability. A lot of businesses are talking about sustainability, SDGs. They are trying to brand everything they do according to sustainability. They're trying to be, I suppose, politically correct. But my argument is that this is the definition of sustainable development, where we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about social welfare, but also environmental protection. The trouble with this topic now is that everyone is talking about sustainability as if it's win-win, as if it is no problem. But I'm going to argue today that we are not paying enough attention to the politics of sustainable development. It isn't always win-win, and particularly in democracies. And I'll show you some examples from around the world where we're doing quite a lot of work. I will talk to you about my own country, Norway. I'm going to talk to you about EV, electric car policy. By the way, I did not see a single electric car in Pisa. I don't want you to buy Tesla, but I was surprised. But in Norway, 96% of the cars that are sold are electric. So there's a lot of, and it's not like it's win-win. There are lots of problematic aspects to that. I'm going to talk to you about Norway. And I'm going to talk to you about another country that I do a lot of research. It's one of the poorest in the world. It's a beautiful country called Malawi in Southern Africa. So very contrasting. Norway, one of the richest, and then one of the poorest. And then I'm going to talk to you about China and India, the two emerging, or maybe they're already superpowers in terms of economics, in terms of politics, the geopolitical tension. So I'll talk to you about 4 cases. But before that, I'm going to make the argument that we should be focusing much more about politics, particularly, Angioletta, since we are in Palazzo Sapienza, the heart of the student protests, right? The transition from fascism to student contestation. I've been reading about it. This is where a lot of the protests arrive. And today, as I speak, a lot of our students want us to challenge established practices. We have Greta Thunberg in Sweden. It's a big movement, right? Fridays for Future. Our students want us to do more, to challenge the status quo. And the question is, are we doing enough? Is it possible to achieve all 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic growth, social welfare, and environmental protection? Or, as I will argue, there are lots and lots of trade-offs. sometimes we can't maximize everything. We have to, as human beings, realize that we're just not good enough to maximize everything. The question is, what is it then that we are not maximizing? So in 2015, I don't know if you're familiar with this. In 2015, 193 countries in the UN General Assembly in September 2015 agreed on these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so the document was about the 2030 agenda. Okay, and the 2030 agenda had these goals. And if you see, we're talking about development goals, economic growth, but also climate and environment, but also global partnership. There was a lot of enthusiasm when this was voted. People said, we are going to change the world, no poverty, no hunger, we're going to have education, good health. All we need is money. All we need is financing for sustainable development. The short story is we were able to make some progress, but we weren't making quite a lot as we had expected. And then the COVID pandemic came, the war in Ukraine arrived, and I'm sorry to say that the international community is now not talking about sustainable development. We are talking about trade wars. We are talking about Trump versus Mexico, Canada, EU, China. We're talking about tariffs. We are talking about drill, baby, drill. That is the motto. It's oil production. Even my own country, Norway, we are now exporting natural gas to Europe because Germany is freezing in the winter. There's no gas from Russia. We feel we're doing Germany and Europe a favor, but we are making trillions and trillions of dollars in the process. We're already rich. We're becoming richer. What does this have to do with sustainability? I will say that before the war in Ukraine, there was quite a lot of interest in the green transition, renewable energy, electric cars. We were going to all transition into greener solutions. Now, with some of the populist politics we see in Europe, all over Europe, if you look at some of the far right, sort of the popularity of the far right parties, we see this also in Scandinavia. A lot of the parties that are saying, where we can't afford to talk about environment and sustainability, we should talk more about welfare. We should talk about increasing the welfare of our populations. Environment can take a back seat. So unfortunately, politics the last few years has reshaped the sustainable development discourse. So if I can just change the slide here. The interesting thing about any kind of global agreement, as you, as lawyers, as political scientists know, we are able to agree and sign on the dotted line if it is not obligatory, if it is not compulsory, okay? If it is voluntary, fine, I'll sign. If it is up to me to decide what measure I will apply, it's fine. But if you tell me you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'll say, oh, no, I don't want to sign. And that is the paradox with global governance, global agreements. You see that, I'm sorry, they're just smaller here. They're non-legally binding rules. These are voluntary goals that can be met if you wish. It's fine. If you don't, it's fine. And that's when we agree. So the very mechanism is weak. You have weak institutions. There is no naming and shaming. You can basically do as you wish. And that is the short story. And we can share the slides with you if you're interested. Non-legally binding rules, voluntary nature, governments can do what they want. And so what we see is since 2015, each country, that's why I'll show you the cases, each country has decided we'll prioritize 1 or 2 goals. The others are not so important. Malawi is landlocked. There's no ocean. So they're not interested in the, the climate goals as much, or, life underwater as much. They are interested in the first 3, 4 goals. It's poverty, it's hunger, it's health. Norway is interested much more in the climate goals because we have our basic needs met. But the thing about sustainable development is that you can't just focus on one. You have to see the whole spectrum. And so that is where some of the challenges lie. So I wish I could be more optimistic. By the way, I have several courses on what works, because I think as professors, our students often tell me, after one whole year, you've just told us about everything that does not work. It's all critical. Everything is bad. There's no hope. So I've developed modules on hope, because we need to move away from doom and gloom, and not everything is bad. There's actually some really good stuff going. But in relation to sustainable development, we only have a few years left until 2030. This message is unfortunately very depressing. And that's where the politics comes in. We are off track. All these ambitious goals, except for some, we are just not meeting them at all. So if you look in the left-hand corner there, you will see that only 15% of the goals that we agreed to in 2015 are on track. And there are many, many, many reasons. I mentioned the pandemic, I mentioned the war in Ukraine, but all of this was already happening before the pandemic. We were just not paying enough attention. There was not enough political commitment. There's something about, and I'd like to hear your views later, if in Italy, in the region, you think there is political interest in sustainability, in sustainable development. We have made some progress in terms of data, in terms of measurement, in terms of understanding, how to measure progress. We have one sector has been fantastic and has embraced sustainable development, and that is the private sector, businesses. In China, in the US, mainly in Scandinavia, you have businesses talking about, all the sustainable development goals. They go around with nice badges. If you go to the website, there's a sustainability officer. And some of the reasons, I was giving a lecture here 2 nights ago, and I was mentioning a lot of the students I have who want to apply for a job, when they go to an interview, they're not just begging for a job. They're actually also asking the employer, how sustainable is your business? Are you actually polluting the atmosphere? If you are in oil and gas, maybe I don't want to work for you. I don't want to work for a fast fashion chain like H&M or Zara. I may want to work for a company that has sustainability right up on the agenda. So we are seeing much more demanding recruitment. A lot of young people want to have higher standards. So we have created more awareness, and some countries have done better than others. And that is what I'm going to talk to you later about. So some of my colleagues, among others at Utrecht University, did a study, and we are also part of that team, where they actually asked these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have they really had a political impact? And the short story is they have not had much political impact, perhaps because they're voluntary. They've had more discursive impact. People talk about sustainability. It's cheap to talk about sustainability. But the political impact, the political commitment has been slow. The awareness has been slow. You have politicians in our country saying, oh, there's an IPCC report on global warming. Okay, fine. I'm not going to think about it. My voters want something else. I'm going to ignore the science. So we see that there's a lot of scientific evidence that is generated, but they're not necessarily having the political impact. So this study shows We talk about sustainability in the regular discourse, but we don't really seem to have political impact. So again, the politics is not being is being underappreciated. And I have been working on this in relation to democracy. As you know, democracy is a system of contestation, right? One wonderful definition of democracy is it's a system where political parties lose elections and leave office when they lose, right? It's not about the winners always, it's about the losers. And that's why when Trump lost the election 4 years ago, that was a test of American democracy because he refused. He said, no, I did not lose. He refused to leave until he was forced out. And so a lot of the institutions in the United States was under stress. So democracy, we're seeing, it's a new kind of a system. Not everybody agrees that environment and climate, these need to be prioritized. I'll give you the example of pensioners in Norway who've been working very, very hard, paying a lot of taxes. Now they are living a lifestyle, a retired lifestyle. You tell them, don't fly that much to Spain. By the way, it's really cold, dark, and slippery in Norway. People want more sun. They want to come to Italy. And if you tell them, don't buy clothes or throw them away, don't eat red meat, it's bad for the climate, don't drink coffee, don't eat avocado, that takes a lot of water, it's coming from Mexico, don't fly, don't do this, don't do that. They're saying, why, come on, I've done my bit, I've paid my taxes. Why should I make the sacrifice? You guys do it. So we see in democratic societies, a lot of voters are not necessarily aligned to the sustainability agenda. There's this pushback. And you see a lot of political parties are using that momentum to gain votes, saying, this happens in many parts of the world, saying, oh, you guys are talking about global goals. That's fifth floor issues. We are stuck in the first floor. We have to solve poverty, hunger. In Norway, the big problem is sometimes it's a free healthcare system, but sometimes we have to wait a few months. People complain. It's free, but you have to wait a few months. So people say, no, we shouldn't wait 3 months. We should wait 5 days. We need more money for healthcare, more money for schools. We should spend less on all of this sustainability thing. So the point is that even in democratic societies, we're seeing this pushback, and there are new voters, new alliances that are questioning our commitment to sustainable development. So let me talk to you a little bit about the electric car policy in Norway, which has got a lot of international attention. So Angioletta mentioned that, I used to live in Palo Alto, Stanford, where Stanford University is. 10 years ago, Stanford had a lot of, at least that area, had a lot of cars that were hybrid. The Toyota Prius, it was very fashionable, like you're environmental conscious, you had a electric, and then Tesla came, Tesla became popular. Model 3 was cheaper, and so people started using it. So it was like a lifestyle announcement. By the way, yesterday I was reading that in the EU, Tesla's market share has decreased by 38%. Could be because of other reasons, could be because of Musk supporting certain political parties or trying to interfere into elections in Europe. Who knows? Yesterday I saw a picture, no Musk or something like, some protest. But anyway, the Palo Alto and Oslo are the two cities I've been living in quite, for the last 10 years. And these are the EV capitals in many ways of the world. And what Norway did, if you look at the bottom right-hand picture, this one here, we actually some years ago thought we could develop our own car. And this was a car called Think, small car, just like the one you need in Pisa to park. I'm fascinated with the parking. You need to fit in nicely. A few years ago, we took our big German car to Amalfi. Bad idea. Just driving. I just parked it. I couldn't. I was afraid to drive. But the Think was just a perfect car, small car with a small battery, small range. But this was too early for its time. It did not catch on. It was a flop. Some people bought it, did not catch. It didn't have luxury. It was like basic. You felt like you were in a matchbox. No, not much protection, not comfortable enough. Anyway, but we realized suddenly there's no point in developing our own car. Let's rather create, and I think, Sylvia, you've talked about wine legislation. It's particularly interesting in terms of EV legislation. Let's create a bunch of incentives that would make electric cars very popular. So what did we do? Taxes waived. No VAT on imported cars. And by the way, the German cars are super expensive. And in Norway, we've traditionally, the state has earned a lot of money from the taxes, the sale tax, the VAT. So the government said, these cars are super expensive, but it's free. You just pay whatever the car costs. We're not going to charge any money, which also meant the government did not receive the revenue from the sale of these cars, which is actually a big chunk of government revenue. They said, we're going to let you buy this car without paying tax, number one. Number two, we're going to build a fast charging infrastructure. So rather than petrol pumps, we'll have high-speed chargers. So Norway has one of the best infrastructures. Every 10 kilometers, you'll find a high-speed charger. And our petrol pumps have now changed from diesel and petrol to just high-speed electric chargers. So that was the second thing. Another incentive, you can park free if it's a municipal parking lot. You can drive in the bus lane in the highways. Okay, you can drive past all the fossil cars. So there were all of these incentives. And then there was the environmental incentive. You are cool. You want to be seen to be progressive. In the beginning, people said, oh, yeah, but the range, there's something called range anxiety. Only 300 kilometers. How can I drive to Italy? I can't do a road trip. And so people said, we'll have two cars, one diesel or petrol and one electric. The electric just for local use. But now with technology, these cars can go 500, 600, kilometers, 700, 800 now on a single charge. Not a problem. So what we did is we realized we couldn't build the cars ourselves, but we'll create a conducive environment for electric vehicles. And so now, next year, Norway is not going to sell a single petrol or diesel car. You can't buy a new car, petrol or diesel. This is it. You have to move. And from the next few months, from April, we're going to tax the petrol and diesel cars even more for pollution. By the way, when we have these tolls, on the roads, so often electric cars pay half of what a diesel car pays to cross. So there are all of these incentives, but it has also had a flip side. Now there are so many electric cars that we can't use the bus lane anymore. The buses are being delayed. So now they're saying we have to use the regular lane because most of the cars have become electric. But this was a successful case of behavioral change with sustained political commitment. Every political party says, yeah, except for some. Most political parties said this is something that we should prioritize. It's good for our environment. You have children suffering from asthma. Sometimes in the winter, the air gets really polluted. We can't breathe because of diesel smoke. Now, some of the other countries I'm going to talk to you about have developed other mechanisms to control pollution. And I've been thinking in Pisa, it would be wonderful if we had more electric cars, like in the city center. You guys love your cars. I mean, I would drive more bicycles, but people are driving here quite a lot. Who knows if this is a good thing? The flip side of this is Norway is really good at keeping things rather clean in our country, but you know that we are very rich because we sell our oil and gas. So we are exporting our pollution to other countries. Maybe you guys are using our oil in China and India and Africa, etc. So we have created a rather clean environment, very little pollution, but our oil is polluting other parts. So that's the flip side, which has enabled us to be successful. Let me quickly talk about another country. I have several visiting professorships in Beijing, but also I teach in Shanghai and many other parts of China. And the Chinese model is very interesting. If you think about the geopolitics today, everything is about US China, and then EU. And also EU China. What is Italy doing? You know, what kind of Chinese investments are coming to Italy? The Belt and Road. People are warning us about AI. They're talking about espionage and the human rights violations, whatever. But when it comes to sustainability, China's political model, as you know, is not democratic. But because it is not democratic, President Xi Jinping can say, look, we have to do this, and it's done. Okay, so I was telling you about pollution, air pollution in Norway. That's why we've gone to electric. In Beijing, Beijing like 10 years ago was one of the most polluted cities in the world. In the winter, you could hardly breathe. They were used to using masks before the pandemic. You know, we were getting used to the mask during the pandemic. They were using masks for a long time. It was just so bad because the Chinese economy was growing. Everybody was buying a car. Everybody was buying a second car. It was just madness. Then what they did is they said, we're going to introduce a lottery system. Depending on the license plate, the number, the last digit of your license plate, if it is odd, you drive on some days. If it is even, if it's 3, some days. If it's 4, some other days. To just control the number of cars. That helped. What really helped is during, the Olympics with the 2008, China, because the whole world was watching, the president said, we need clean air. So shut down all industries that were polluting around Beijing. You can't do that in a democracy, but you can do that in China. Just shut it down. So voila, suddenly clean air, blue sky. So China has been able to do quite a lot of progressive stuff within the country. In fact, a lot of my Chinese colleagues and students, because the economy has grown, because there's so many people who become middle class, for them, it is not getting a new mobile phone or more money. It is blue sky. That's what they dream about, like the blue sky of Pisa, clean air. They want to go to the mountains. That's the kind of dream and aspiration. It's no longer about economic growth only. So on a rather funny side, a Norwegian company started exploiting this desire for blue skies and clean air. They were marketing, these small spray cans of fresh Norwegian air that you could buy in China and just spray your room, clean air, just a gimmick, or selling bottled water from Norway. I mean, just rubbish, really. But so China has a totally different model because of its political system. This is Shanghai. This is really this is from the Bund in Shanghai. This is Pudong area where you have all these skyscrapers. 15 years ago, this was a crime-infested region. It was just a lot of crime, no development. And so now you have all of this infrastructure development. Every year I go to China, there's a new building, 3 buildings. Everything has changed. But it comes at the cost of pollution of different types. So this is a wonderful picture the Chinese government would like to show the tourists, including Chinese tourists. Look, your country was poor, but now, look, we are developing, which also means that you have a lot of fascinating experimental buildings. This is the China CCTV headquarters. It's called China Trousers. It looks like trousers. And this is a building that I usually drive past every day when I teach at a university in Beijing. This is a beautiful day. It's clear. But usually it can be polluted. So for me, every day when I walk or drive past, I see the sky. And increasingly, I find it's getting cleaner in Beijing because of some of these measures I talked to you about, different types of controls of who can drive, but also shutting down polluting industries around Beijing. So there's quite a lot of talk about sustainability. So contrast that to what Trump and the US are doing now. They're saying, forget about any of these. He's pulling the US out of the Paris Accords again. Biden, of course, reversed it. Trump has reversed it back. He's pulled out of the WHO. In a year, they're not going to be part of it. Many, many UN organizations. So sustainability is just absolutely at the bottom of the political agenda in the US and also in some European countries. It's quite high up on the agenda of China. China is actually supporting this. Well, they're also building solar panels. It's getting cheaper. By the way, I'm seeing a lot of solar panels here in the vineyards of Tuscany. Lots of people using renewable energy. Solar panels were expensive. Now they're getting cheaper because of Chinese production. There's also the other concern. Chinese electric cars are taking over Europe. Okay, so Tesla's market share is decreasing because China is offering better cars than the Germans and the Americans or the Japanese, cheaper, more technology. And now, this is the fascinating thing. From a sustainable perspective, this is good. Cheaper solar panels, more electric cars, but the politics comes in. In Italy, they will say, but we need our jobs. We want Fiat and Maserati. We want the Italian companies to thrive. The Germans are really worried. Volkswagen is losing, business. So they're saying, oh, but this is unfair. The government of China is subsidizing the electric manufacturers so much that they're outcompeting the Americans and the Europeans. So from a sustainability perspective, cheaper cars, cheaper solar panels is good. From a political perspective, no, we need jobs in our country. We should drive Italian and German and Norwegian cars, whatever. So there we see, a bit of a challenge. I don't know if you remember, I don't know how old you are. Remember Katie Melua, the singer? A few, 10, 15, 20 years? 20 years ago. Okay, you guys are too young. She had a song called There Are 9 Million Bicycles in Beijing. Have you heard it? Okay, some people have. I should never bring up songs. It's a generational thing. Anyway, but it was a big hit because there were so many bicycles in Beijing. People were, biking everywhere. But with economic development, people are driving more. Now bicycles are making a comeback. So you see on the streets of many, many Chinese cities, you have that. So the short story is that China has a lot of political commitment for sustainable development. India, the opposite. It's a democracy. It's a democracy. It has the largest population in the world. And as you know, like in Italian politics, it's contestation. It is about fighting for certain values that are deemed to be crucial. So here you have, again, just using the same example of polluted cities. If you look at the 10 most polluted cities in the world, I think 4 are in India. But does this mean that India is not doing anything? No. They did the same. They tried to implement the same odd and even scheme, like I told you they did in Beijing. Same scheme was implemented in New Delhi. You could drive on certain days. You can't on other days. This is a view from my hotel in Delhi, a winter where it's just smog. It's not fog, it's smog. It is so difficult to breathe. It's just unhealthy. It's like, I don't know, 400-500 times the WHO permissible limit. It's like smoking 20 cigarettes every day. So you have a system here in India saying, we will have transportation using natural gas. We will try have electric cars. None of this has worked. So when the government said we will have an odd and even scheme, a lot of citizens went to court saying, this is a violation of my democratic rights. I don't accept it. My right to drive, which you did not have, of course, in China. You don't contest it as much. And I wanted to show you something else, which I think is getting to be a big, big problem. We often focus on air pollution, but increasingly for me, because I suppose I'm getting old, noise pollution. Noise really, I mean, sometimes I hear, your people love to honk, right? It's like, it's a lovely thing, but Italy is nothing compared to India in terms of using the horn. I mean, my wife has a very sophisticated explanation as to why people use. They may be frustrated, they're angry, their wives or their husbands have said something bad. You just have nothing to do. You just put the finger, your hand on the horn. Now, this is last year. I was visiting my father. I was born in India many years ago. I've lived in Norway for 35 years. My father was sick, and I spent a month in a part of Calcutta, which is called Salt Lake City. And what is fascinating is Calcutta, India, lots of unplanned cities. But 50 years ago, the government planned a new city. Okay? And the city is so well planned that it has straight roads, it should have footpaths, it has roundabouts, it has playgrounds, parks in every area. Everything is planned. And there are blocks, AA, BB, CC, AC, BC, like that. It's very, very planned. Okay, it's like an architect planned it. But each part of the city has to have a sidewalk, a footpath to walk on. But what has happened, which is what I wanted to show you in the previous picture, is that it is impossible to walk on the footpath because there's always something. Now, there are now electric rickshaws. You know the rickshaw, right? In the old days, people were pulling the rickshaw. Then you saw the invention of the cycle rickshaw. Now you have the electric rickshaw, very sustainable. Okay, so in some ways, things are moving forward. And I was going through, that's the Google map. I was doing this roundabout. It's like 5 kilometers. Every evening I needed a walk. And so I was walking around and I noticed that I could not walk. I had to walk on the road, which also meant, you see, there's always some construction. There's a tree. There's an electric box. Here we have a system. Everything is planned. I love your footpaths in Pisa, by the way. It's just, I also like it in Italy. You have a lot of covered footpaths, like on the main road, the shopping area. If it's raining, you can still walk, right? If it's in the summer, it's shade. Here, what happens is you're forced to walk on the road. What happens then? You have cars, and people are becoming richer. So the middle class has so many cars. In the old days, there was 1 car per house. Now there are 4, 5, 7 cars for each house. There's no place to park the car. It is just madness. So what I experienced was, and this is what I wanted to show you, if we can, this is what happens. Angeletta, if you can just press this one, the play, this one. Can you just see? Yeah, that one, yeah. This is what happens. Just, yeah. There's a play. There's no reason to honk. This is not the worst. It's just worse in some part. It's just an illustration. And you know, my Apple Watch keeps telling me sound pollution, loud noise, this is dangerous. And so then I downloaded an app, you know, for sound. And I was measuring the decibel levels. It was just so high. Turns out it's worse in front of hospitals where it's supposed to be quiet. But my point about all of this is to tell you that even a well-planned situation where people, and the explanation is that there are too many people walking on the street, and then the drivers are saying, without pressing the horn, people will not move. There are many other reasons why they do it, but that is one of the reasons that I found that explains too many people walking on the street, they don't listen. We have the opposite system in Norway, the case. Because the electric cars don't make noise, we have a false noise that is produced in the electric car. But that is fine. People will still hear it. But most of the kids with their headphones, they're walking, they can't hear it. And I'm sometimes like driving back. I don't want to honk. It's the opposite thing. But my point about all of this is that it's a democratic system. There are rules, a city that is planned, and nothing is done about sound pollution. It's almost like that's how it is. We've given up. That's what the Indians are saying. But for me, that sound pollution is leading to so many health problems. People having, ear problems, they can't, it's stress. Your blood pressure actually increases through that sound. I don't know, in Italy, in Rome, I'm sure it's the same. I mean, I've driven in Rome. I usually drive, park, and I never drive again. But I think that's something that we can do. It should not be that difficult. Okay, the final example, Malawi. It is the third, fourth, fifth poorest country in the world, but that is not the identity of Malawi. It's a small country of 20 million people, has been democratic since 1994, had a dictatorship for 30 years, the most lovely country in Africa that you can visit. People are smiling, there's very little crime, safe, politically stable. And I've been researching, studying that country for the last 20 years. And I go there 3-4 times a year. I've taught, I send a lot of tourists. A lot of my students go there for tourism. It is just so beautiful. But just one case about this country that I'd like to tell you about is energy security is a big, big problem. We are so used to electricity here all the time, okay? And only 10% of the Malawian population has access to the grid. 10% of the 20 million. Even if you do have access to the grid, there's a lot of power cuts. It's not uninterrupted electricity. It's not just a problem in Malawi. In Africa, 600 million people, 600 million people do not have access to energy. That's the SDG 7, clean energy. Things we take for granted, they can't. See, imagine studying, charging your phone, ironing, regular things. You have to, it's actually a wonderful excuse for some of my colleagues if I say, why didn't you deliver that article on deadline? They said, there was no electricity. So it's a very nice excuse to have. But anyway, that is a big problem. So what then is the country doing? Well, it turns out if you don't have electricity, how do you cook? I don't know, you guys use gas maybe more? Yeah, in Norway, it's just electricity, okay? So let's say there's no natural gas, there's no gas, there's no cooking gas available. It is now getting more and more popular. It comes all the way from South Africa in trucks, but it's expensive, so only the middle class and the restaurants can afford. Most people use charcoal. You know, charcoal that you burn from the forest? This is what's happening in Malawi. When you fly in, you see this is the country, okay? A lot of trees are disappearing. The forests of Malawi are becoming absolutely empty. People are just cutting down trees. That is often the only source of income for many people, burning them in small piles, making small plastic bags of charcoal and selling it in the cities where people use it in stoves to cook, to boil water, to make food. It's a charcoal-based economy. Okay, now, officially, charcoal is illegal in Malawi. So the government, and again, in terms of legislation from a law perspective, the government said, we will introduce legislation saying you have to have a license to produce charcoal under, controlled circumstances. But most people are disregarding that. They just, because that's the only way out. So they're making charcoal, selling it, and we're having a huge problem with deforestation. With deforestation, you're having drought, more frequent drought. Temperatures are increasing. And so you have total violation of a political agreement, legislation, because there is no other alternative. So you have a lot of press reports, and I've just finished an article on this issue. You have all the legislation in place. It's a democratic society, but the government and all actors are just turning their heads. We just don't, because there is no alternative. Will you let people starve? And then you have a lot of the international donors saying, oh, you should look out for the forests. But it doesn't help to talk about forest protection if you don't give people an alternative. And that's the case of Malawi. So this is how they sell. And what is fascinating is that it's illegal, but it's the police who buy and use it openly in the police station. The members of parliament are stopping using it. Everybody uses it. And it's just a paradox. How can something illegal be so visible and used every day? The first thing you notice when you land in Malawi is people are transporting charcoal openly in front of police checkpoints that are supposed to control the flow of this illegal. It's like a black diamond. So just to end, 2 years ago, some of us, we wrote a piece in Science magazine reflecting on the Sustainable Development Goals and the SDGs. You know, I told you the story is that we haven't really made much progress. What do we do now? We suggested 4 reforms that the international community, we were hoping that the UN would adopt these, that governments. I think we've had some influence, but not much. So one had to do with, we can't really have this voluntary nature, as I told you. We have to have something that is legalized. There should be a legalization of certain things, whether it is a treaty on plastic pollution. Some things have to be obligatory, otherwise we can't enforce these. So there's something about legalization, but also differentiation and making these more dynamic. The problem with SDGs or any of these global governance mechanisms is that it's the same standard for each country, whether it is Norway or Malawi or China or India, it's the same standard. We can't have that. The richer countries should be held to a higher standard because they can afford it. But we don't do that. So we can hide behind very, very low thresholds and say, we've made a, we've done quite well. We also think there should be greater institutionalization. There should be naming and shaming. It was almost like the Human Rights Council. Like some people should be shamed. You're just not doing a good enough job. Norway should not just be praised because of electric cars. It should also be criticized because of outsourcing its pollution. I've been to many of these UN meetings. It's called the High Level Forum for the SDGs every July, and it's just a talking club. People just talk. And it's supposed to be peer reviews, but if I'm reviewing you, I talk to you before and say, hey, come on, go easy on me, okay? So if you are reviewing me, you don't say much. It's like, oh, Dan, your country is so fantastic. You guys are doing so well. And when it's my turn, I say, you the same thing. It doesn't work. It's just a talking club, and that's what we need to change, and you can have a look at it. Final 2 slides, just to bring it all together. The politics of sustainable development, the politics of climate change really need to be revisited. It's not just win-win. There's a lot of things that we can do better. It also turns out, and this is something you may or may not know, there's been a resurgence of the so-called global south. That's why I showed you China and India. They are big players. South Africa, the BRICS. You've heard of the BRICS, right? I thought that organization was dead and buried. And suddenly, 2 years ago, they resurrected like Jesus Christ. They're back. And people are now, talking. The G20, by the way, has become very, very important. The last 4 years, it's the big global South countries that have had the G20 presidency. Indonesia, India, last year Brazil, this year South Africa. They are shaping a lot of these global governance mechanisms, but they also feel that anything to do with climate, sustainability is always shaped by the global North. It's the rich countries that talk about it. It doesn't mean that the global South is uninterested. China talks about something called ecological civilization. It's almost like sustainable development. It's their own term. India has developed something called lifestyle for environment. So there's a lot of new ideas, not all of it very clear. It's not always clear to understand what these terms mean, but there's this feeling that anything to do with climate and sustainable development should not just be influenced by the debates in the global North. It should also be used in the global South. Final point has to do with energy security. And here we see that Africa is really pleading, saying, please, we need electricity. 600 million people are living in darkness. It's called the dark continent. Nobody's paying any attention. And you see now that the US aid does not exist, the organization, the biggest donor. You go to their website, it doesn't exist. It's just going to disappear. Samantha Powers and was just doing some fantastic work. It doesn't exist. At the same time, the Americans are saying the Chinese are taking over Africa. But the Americans are not doing anything in Africa. So they're complaining about, and China has a huge track record of building infrastructure, energy projects. China even has said, we're not going to build coal-fired power plants in Africa because it's polluting, only hydropower. So a lot of African politicians say, it's fine. Yeah, there are lots of problems with Chinese projects, but what's the alternative? We have nobody. And that is where we are. It's that we often talk, it's about geopolitics, it's about politics, it's about China bashing without having much of a solution. I'm sorry, I've used too much time. I actually had one final slide with my podcast, but that has disappeared. If you're interested, thanks for announcing this, Angioletta. It's called In Pursuit of Development. You can just search me up. It's on Spotify, Apple, and you'll hear lots of these debates with scholars. I mean, Daron Acemoglu, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics last year, he's been on my show twice. Lots of, even Gro Harlem Brundtland, the mother of sustainable development, lots of prime ministers, former ministers, Africans, Asians, lots of debates. If you're interested, have a look. It doesn't cost you anything. It's free. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, I hope I haven't painted too grimy, depressing picture. I think there is a lot of things, there is hope, but we really need to first accept that it's not win-win. It's the politics that we should be focusing much more on. And it's easy for me to say that because I'm a political scientist, and I see that Professor Balestrina has also joined me here. So we have some political scientists in the room now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for this very stimulating, very interesting lecture. Here you have you meet law PhD students, so some of them are not familiar with this topic, but I think that you raised a lot of issues that are at the core of our interest, legal interest. You raised issues concerning populism, how the pursuit of the SDG goals is also affected by the rise of populist narratives, the weakness of international organization as well. So, and also the democratic backsliding across different jurisdictions. So, what can we do to counter this populist narrative? As a constitutional law scholar, I'm interested, particularly interested in how we can counter populist narratives and support the pursuit of sustainable development goals. Is it possible that an answer could come from the people, especially now that people is for instance, in Italy, very concerned about climate change and the consequences of climate change. I mean, of course, the populist narratives are run against the ideals on which the Sustainable Development Goals were built, but at the same time, also populist narratives can also try to meet the expectation of societies, of local communities, of their own interest. And now within this basic interest, now we have our safety, our our concerns for the risks coming from the climate change. Can this be a way in which we can foster a bottom-up answer to, and in the long run also support the pursuit of sustainable development goals? Thank you.
Thank you, Angeletta. That was a super important question. I suppose this is where we have to first think a little bit about our role as academics. And this is where I told you I'll talk a little bit about Circle U. But that is what we're doing, right? We are saying we should have these debates. We should question. We should be critical. We should be balanced. We should be independent. In terms of the far right, the populist narratives, I think our goal as academics is not just to go one-sided, to actually challenge, to show the evidence. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that politicians often are ignoring the evidence. We need to make sure it's in their face. You can't just dismiss. It's like Trump, fake news, and that just goes. We can't just let that be as easily dismissed. So I think we need that mobilization, making sure this is the palace of knowledge, right? So we have to make this palazzo has to be the area where one is challenging, contesting, that critical adversarial politics. And we see the young generation doing that with Greta Thunberg and her generation. They're questioning us. I don't always agree with them. I think they sometimes think there are easy solutions. In politics, there's always compromise. But I think the first thing we need to do is to challenge these one-sided policies and show the scientific evidence. And then I suppose there is that aspect of protests, which not all of us are comfortable with. As academics, we can show the evidence and then we hope that somebody else will take over it. So I think as we need to be better at disseminating. I think some of the challenge is also that we say, oh, it's so easy. And that is my argument that, oh, sustainability, we'll somehow do it. I think we have to say, be honest, not everything is easy. And sometimes we have to choose. There is a trade-off. Let's openly talk about it. Some of the green parties often don't talk enough about welfare and trade-offs. They need to adjust. One of my former students is the deputy leader of the Green Party of Norway, and they were fantastic at implementing very controversial rules like making it very expensive to drive in the Oslo city center and paying a lot of tolls, etc. She was one of the most hated politicians. Fantastic ideas, and she was bold enough to implement them. So I think we see that, but her Green Party is not winning that many votes now because many other political parties are realizing that climate is also something that gives them new votes. So they're adopting that agenda, which is great. So I think there's something that we can do to just put that evidence in front and to keep up that questioning, that dissemination, right? That's at least one answer, but there may be many others, Angeletta.
And the Circle U, in this respect, offer an important opportunity for us to join our strength and to join different expertise in many different fields of law, social, political sciences, climate, and medicine. So it's a good opportunity also.
Now we have also a new hub in Circle U on AI.
Yes, artificial intelligence.
And it's Francesco Marcelloni
is the director, yes, of the hub.
So you can talk about health and democracy and climate and artificial intelligence. And there are lots and lots of events and we hopefully we have lots of courses. There's actually a course on the politics of sustainable development I'm offering in Oslo in May. So again, you are welcome to join and apply for it.
Yeah. Okay, now I give the floor to the PhD students, all those who have questions.
You can use my mic.
Time for a Q&A session. There's some.
I think we need to use this so that people.
Okay, so my question concerns the last presidential American election, because my impression is that in that case, sustainable development was not a key question. For what I saw, both parties decided to avoid this topic. Maybe because it's considered a slippery one. I don't know. But I find this impressive because voters seems not to cast their votes on the basis of sustainable development, but prefer to consider other things. So I would like to have some consideration about this topic.
Good question. I think that is actually one of the answers to Professor Sperti's question, is that how can we make sustainable development climate an attractive policy measure to gain votes? And we see that, at least in Scandinavia, in Norway, we see that a lot of young people actually vote. I was telling you they want a job in a company that is actually clean and green. There are higher levels. And we saw that the Green Party in Norway was attracting, firstly, a younger voting crowd and also urban. So the challenge for these parties has been to get votes from the rural areas or from outside the major cities, where things like the electric car range is 300, 400, 500 kilometers. For them, it's not good enough. On a winter's day, the range goes down. I want a diesel car. So we have a farmers' party called the Center Party that says, I mean, all of this is fine, but it's only good for these city folks. So what we are seeing sometimes is the vote is becoming very sort of polarized between the cities and the countryside. I think that's the big challenge, is to reach out to the countryside, to the farmers, and say, hey, come on, this is actually something in your interest. So I think the crucial thing is to make the case, a persuasive case to the voters. It's in your interest to eat less red meat. It's for your health. It's not because we are forcing you. It's for your health. It's like smoking. Don't smoke because it's good. So I think somehow to make that case, it's not always easy. Sometimes it's easy in Norway. Oh, there's no snow this year. Must be climate change. And we are worried. The next year, lots of snow. Oh, no problem. Everything is fine. So I think something like that, to talk more about it, but also to offer solutions. This is a big problem in this debate. We keep talking about doom and gloom. It's getting worse. It's hotter. Everything is bad. We don't talk enough about what people can do, number one. Number two is that there's often a lot of focus on individual responsibility. Don't buy clothes, don't eat this, don't travel, use energy. We don't talk about systemic solutions. You know, what are the incentives? If the EV policy of Norway could be implemented in many other things, if you're eating healthy, maybe it should be cheaper to buy those products, not more expensive to buy organic food. So some sort of incentive, financial or otherwise, that will reach out to voters. I think that could be one way. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. That has been very, very interesting. And I was wondering, when planning the electric car new incentives, if Norway also addressed or thought about the future, for example, what to do with the batteries and how to address then the production of batteries and everything, if it was already in the idea.
Very good question. I don't think nearly enough. And that's one of the criticisms of Norwegian public policy, is that we're too fast sometimes, running too fast. Do you want to be the best? One example was that we moved from FM radio to DAB, the digital radio. We thought that was the future. It turns out only Norway has implemented it. Nobody else has. So we were a little too quick, and people are saying that's not very good. We should have still retained. We should not have closed down the FM station. And it's a bit like that. In terms of battery, we are good at recycling. But if you think about it, it's only now that the first generation of electric cars are being phased out. And I don't really have a good answer to your question. What will happen to that? What do we do with the batteries? Because while the electric cars don't pollute, the production process is quite polluting. Where are the cobalt and all the lithium coming from? It's coming from Congo and Africa. There's also an ethical aspect here. Are they getting enough for revenue from all the electric cars that are being used in Europe? So I don't think we've thought enough about it. I think that's the problem that we're going to face today, tomorrow, day after, when we start selling that first generation. First generation is like 10 years old now. Most companies offer 8-year guarantee on the battery, but I really don't know what one does with that research. That's something I need to investigate. But it's a really, really good question, because I think it's that future thing. One thing is to just start now. What do we do later on? And how long can an electric car survive? How many years can you drive it? After the 8-year guarantee goes out, what happens? That is also what a lot of people are worried about. They say the fossil fuel cars go on for 20 years. So yeah, I don't think we're always thinking too much in the future. That's also something in Norwegian politics we talk about, is that we build an airport, we think it's for the future, and then 5 years later, we think it's too small. Why didn't we build it, bigger in the first place? It's this. Sometimes we are conservative, but I think we are not always into long-term planning. on the AI. Yeah, it's from Pablo. Yeah. Great question, Pablo. I don't know the answer, but I can speculate. And this is where the debate is. There is one group of scholars and politicians who put a lot of faith in technology and AI. And the argument is that don't worry, it'll all be taken care of because every day we have new solutions. Let's not obsess. Don't be too fearful. It's not doom and gloom. This will somehow sort itself out. In the worst case, we can move to another planet, to Mars or some other planet. The criticism against these tech optimists is that they are delaying what Sylvia was asking, right? They're delaying that action that we should take today in the hope that in the future technology will solve it. So the criticism is that we can't just let technology rule the world. This is the argument from Daron Acemoglu, one of the winners of the Nobel Peace Economics Prize last year. You can hear him mention this on my podcast too, where his argument is that technology is great only if humans, this is the latest book with Simon Johnson, who also got the prize, technology must be controlled, the development by humans. It should be human, it should address human needs. It can't just run amok. And his criticism of Silicon Valley and the AI technology people is that they are doing on their own agenda. You don't know what OpenAI is doing. Is it just profits? It should be based on, Daron's argument is that any technological development should be assessed. Is it improving our human lives? And this was something that he says, like in terms of, the Ford Motor Company, in terms of the automobile industry, there was always that, is it helping us become more mobile? Yes, it was. Certain technologies, we have a long history of it actually helping. So the short answer is that, and I think I agree with Daron, is that, yes, we should be optimistic, but we need to somehow exercise more control over the development of AI. It can't be just left up to some elites on Silicon Valley to develop this according to their interests. And I am particularly interested in how AI can help poor countries in the global south. It's not just about ChatGPT. It is about, it's great with translation tools. Imagine now, when I go to China, I don't speak Chinese. I've been going there for the last 10 years. I use Apple and Apple Translate. Google is banned. So Apple Translate works wonders. I am much more able to do that. Technology means I use an app to pay in China and India. No bank cards, no, you can order Ubers, whatever. It's great. But in terms of poverty reduction, how is that going to help? Agriculture, food production. Will technology help us, less polluted growth of food so that we can feed the world? That is where I think. So we have to be cautiously optimistic of AI.
Thank you so much for your presentation and thank you for the reading you provided us. I have a questions about India, as you are familiar with this, let's say, environment. So in your paper, you were talking about the way Prime Minister Modi was developing the environmental agenda in India. And if I'm correct, he was also conferred the Champions of the Heart Award. And here I quote, for his bold environmental leadership on the global stage. But at the same time, I wonder how much of this is just talk, because I was thinking about the way he behaved towards the National Green Tribunal, which we know, the National Green Tribunal, which we know is a unique environmental tribunal who advanced the right to a healthy environment. So I was thinking about the rat hole mining sentence, or the sentence about pollutions of rivers during religious festivals. I know that he didn't proceed.
Tieni più vicino il microfono,
Yes, sure.
perché non si
Okay. He didn't proceed with judicial appointments, so this creates a backlog in the work of the tribunal. So if you can comment on that, thank you.
Another great question. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because on the one hand, my examples of India and China show that President Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi of India, is it this? No, some other song, went back from the UN General Assembly in 2015 when the SDGs were adopted, and they were super enthusiastic. They were like, oh, they embraced the idea. This is great. Both our countries should be talking about sustainable development goals. But there was one main reason, I would say, why they embraced it. Both countries were going through a problem in terms of unemployment. Even though there was economic growth, unemployment was growing. So for a leader, it's good to say, look, don't be so worried about jobs, etc. We also have to think about the environment. It's almost like a very good excuse to divert attention. So you're right that, India talks about lifestyle for environment, China talks about ecological civilization, but again, it's not always consistent. So while China has built all the infrastructure it needs, high-speed trains, I love Freccia Rossa, but it's not as fast as the Chinese trains. That's 300 kilometers, yeah? Super good network, roads. They've finished building the infrastructure, not in the west of China, but largely. India still hasn't. Indian railways is still dependent on what the British did. There's really no super fast trains. The roads are getting better, but not there. So I think India is like taking one step forward, two steps back, always thinking, oh, it's also employment, it's also roads, it's also development. And that's why India and China and many of the global South countries in international negotiations say, rich countries, stop preaching. You guys don't have extreme poverty. We still have poverty. We need more time. Let us use coal. We can't become like you. You have polluted, you should do the changes, give us more time. But having said that, India is embracing solar energy. Digital payments has become super advanced, much more advanced than in Europe. You don't need, everything is just based on the app. I mean, there's so much development taking place there, but still in terms of energy, coal, there's a lot of pollution. In terms of cars, but also the people. I mean, India and China account for what, 2/5 of the world's population, if not more. So there are huge challenges. And I think the last thing I want to mention is that there are so many contradictions. It's never one-sided. It's like you do one thing and then there's the politics. Somebody else wants something else. And in order to get their votes, you're willing to change. And that is what Indian democracy is about. It is often very messy. It's not always very clean, straightforward. So one step back, one step forward, two steps back all the time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Stefano Rovelli, and I am a PhD student in constitutional law and constitutional justice. I beg your pardon for my English. I hope I have two questions. The first one is, which could be the role of constitutional courts in this politics? And I thought about that with you were talking about the India case and people who ask the courts to defend their democratic rights. And the second question is, which is the role of war in our war? We said today that with the Ukrainian war, we stopped talking about this politics. But my question is about another point. Well, for example, I mean, we talked about Norway. Norway is a fantastic example of this politics, But Norway is also a member of OTAN, military alliance, I read that Norway sent weapons to Ukraine. And so my question is, how much pollution produces one day of war in Ukraine? One day which we used weapons of Italy, Norway, United States, Russia, China. Because I'm from a region in Italy, Sardinia, that is a paradise. But for example, we have a problem with military pollution because we have the greatest military bases in Europe with Sweden. And for this reason, there are some natural parameters that can't be sane, where people can't much pollution because they use the weapons that produces a lot of pollution.
There's just one great question after another. Let me start with the second one. Super important point. We're not nearly talking enough about the pollution from the bombings. But why Ukraine? Also Gaza, same thing, right? Trump has the idea that he's going to take over Gaza, throw the Palestinians out, and he's going to make it into paradise, a Riviera. Who knows? And now people are saying there's no money for him to buy it. Where's the money going to come from? Anyway, the point is that we don't nearly talk enough about pollution from war and conflict. That's one thing. Number two is, this is where the democratic politics comes in. In our parts of the world, I'm not so sure about Italy, but in Norway, the discourse is, this is an existential situation, a fight for human freedom that trumps everything. And so it is about promoting, making sure sovereignty of Ukraine is maintained. We will not talk about all the other consequences. But maybe we should be also thinking about what we are doing. It's not just Norway, Denmark has sent fighter planes, F-16s. So there is absolutely, that aspect is just forgotten. But in our societies, that's what I was saying, is the trade-off. Freedom first, then we'll talk about all the other stuff. Maybe once the war is over, if it does get over, that's when I think there will be a counting of all the bad aspects, including the environmental effects. Your first issue about the constitutional courts, India is actually a very good case, but also South Africa, where a lot of human development has been promoted because the judiciary has been activist, a very activist judiciary that has interpreted the right to life as which is a fundamental right. Right? We often talk about first generation and second generation rights. Development such as food, health is not considered to be fundamental, but the Indian Supreme Court has interpreted the right to life to also mean right to food. In South Africa, that has also been interpreted as a right to health. And what they've done, the activist judiciary in many parts of the world, is to say, if somebody is dying from hunger, then that person's right to life is being violated. And thereby, the government has the duty to make sure that people have enough food. So what has happened is in India, there's actually a whole bunch of legislation on the right to food. And the courts have held successive governments to account when there have been newspaper reports of starvation deaths. So that's where we see quite a lot of intervention, but it has not happened as much in environmental issues. I studied a case in southern India many years ago where the leather industry, like you have in Italy, the tanneries, were polluting the river. And a public interest litigation appeal was filed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court got in. They made sure that each tannery had to install an effluent treatment system so that they could not just pollute the river. So there are lots of these cases, but implementation is always a challenge. The courts are very good at gaining, taking up these cases if there's a civil society, petition that is filed, but the courts can't always enforce and follow up. You're dependent on the civil society organizations to keep petitioning the courts. So the courts are good at making very important judgments that become symbolic, and they're only successful if political parties, the government, enacts these. So that is, I think, the challenge with the courts. They're very good at coming up with very activist, far-reaching, progressive judgments, but it's still left to the political arena to enforce them. And that's that political versus legal empowerment that I've also been working on, and we can talk more about it.
Good morning, and thank you for your intervention. My name is Matteo. I'm a first-year PhD candidate as Stefano, so we are in the same course. My question is, I was very interested when you talked about I think it was point 4 of the reform suggested, which was the institution. My question is, I'm trying to collect all the dots. You said like a very small word regarding smoke. Then suddenly, in a phase in history, government said, "Okay, smoking it's bad," and they started to ban. And for example, also in Italy, I think Milan is banning it from some areas, and then so on. Yeah, they started to do something like that. Yeah, and my question is, does this emphasize the relationship with the lobbying system? I want to the lobbying system. Yeah, because you said that there's a lot of talking in the society regarding the how to say thematic topics. Sorry, I'm emotional. So topics regarding sempre topic, scusate. Environmental topics. Sorry, I'm really yeah, environmental topics. But there's not a follow-up by the parties and the politics. But as I can see, there's also a lot of activities deriving from big four companies. They have sustainable offices, but in my opinion, they're mostly like a thing that they can show on their websites and then direct the legislative works on their field. I just recall very quickly the companies of oil, like British Petroleum, or the tobacco companies that in Italy tried again to, not many years ago, like 5 years ago, to build other stations where to follow, and they just changed their name. They said they were going to sell new products, not more cigarettes, but electric cigarettes. So yes, my question is, if your point 4 of reforms, the legislative to create an institution, it's also in order to limit all the lobbying powers for these great societies. And I'm sorry for my emotions, sorry.
It's a super good and very relevant question. So I think one of the things I would like to say is that whenever we talk about human rights and law, etc., we always think that some people are pushing for change, progressive change. What we sometimes forget is that there's always somebody pushing back against that change. It's not always everybody's for. There are also people against. And it would be a mistake for us to think, that's why I was saying it's not win-win. There's always somebody pushing back. And you're right, it's the lobby groups. To think about powder milk, Nestle has been in lots of conversations with food experts saying, why are you, it's natural breast milk, that should be the thing. You're making it cool to sell this kind of powder milk. So or smoking, if you remember, it was all about the macho man, the Marlboro man, right? It's cool to do certain things. And your letters were saying about our children, they think it's cool to eat at McDonald's, I mean, even though I don't understand why you would like to go to McDonald's in Italy, but so I think there's something about people pushing back. So every time there's a progressive legislation, you have the oil industry, the tobacco industry, everybody rebranding. You're absolutely right. Coming up with a name. I have a good example. Our oil company in Norway was called Statoil, oil of the state. It rebranded itself as Equinor. Equinor, equi as in equitable, Norway. So if you think about Equinor, is it oil? What are they doing? It is still oil and gas. So it is that branding that helps people shift. And then there's the other aspect. What does the Norwegian oil company say? We say, we know that oil is bad, but our oil is the cleanest in the world. So we should be the last country to stop oil production because Saudi Arabia and all the Middle East, they are the worst. and oil is still not going to be needed in the world. So there's this pushback and an alternative narrative that makes voters say, oh yeah, maybe so. There's a third aspect. A lot of these companies will appeal to your senses, our senses. Look, we are contributing a lot to the economy by paying taxes, creating jobs. You shut us down, it's going to be chaos. And then we're worried. How will we get free healthcare, free education? Oh yeah. So we have to continue. So there has to be that discussion, again, going back to Angeletta's question, right? I mean, we have to counter each of these. It's almost like we need deliberative democracy of a different type. We should deliberate, discuss, agree. Is there a short-term, medium-term, long-term solution? And to really challenge these discourse, is Norwegian oil really the cleanest? Can you do things differently? Why do you assume that oil will still be needed in 100 years? Things like that. So I think in the food industry, in the energy industry, every industry we see pushback. And every time we see that rebranding effort, we should question and really focus on the lobbyists. In the US, lobbyists are seen to be a very integral part of the political system. In Norway, in Europe, I would say it's like a bit more invisible. There are lots of think tanks now that are sprouting up, that are coming up with these lobby messages. You never know. They say it's a think tank. You think it's independent. You don't know who's funding them. What message are they promoting? So I think these are things that we as students, as academics, should be aware of, and to maybe highlight and question and discuss. I think that's a super, super good question. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for this precious lecture. I think that it is very interesting, the comparison you made, but even more interesting is to talk about global politics, like you made in the last slides. It is important, for example, as you point in one of your articles, where you talk about the agricultural sector development report that was published in China, in which the government states that it is not afraid of running out of food. And this is possible thanks to China's gradual acquisition of agricultural land in other states, in particular in Africa. So I just want to ask you, how can this problem of interference of some states' policies on other in favor of democracy can be solved?
Thank you. Wonderful question. So that's where the political trade-offs take place. If you're Italy, you are thinking, make Italy great again, just like make America great again, make China great again. We're going to follow the Chinese dream, the Italian dream. I don't know what dream. Everybody has, I would say, particularly since the pandemic, we've become much more closed. We're thinking much more, globalization is now passé. Globalization is dead. We have to produce the masks ourselves. We have to be self-sufficient in food. So I think there has been that increased awareness that if there's a war or whatever, we have to manage. China has been thinking about this actually a lot before the pandemic. So for China, it's important to have a steady supply of pork. Okay, you have to, where does the pork come from? Well, maybe from Latin America. Soya is coming from Brazil and Latin America. So Chinese companies have been investing, cultivating relationships. For China, it's relational power. It's not a one day thing. They invest, they're there for a long time, they're building infrastructure, maybe also building a hotel, a restaurant, side business, making sure there's a steady supply of pork and soya, which is absolutely crucial to China. And so there's been that sort of a long sort of term policy. China has not done that kind of land grab as many other Middle Eastern companies have often done these land grabs in Africa, where they cultivate in Ethiopia food, that is then shipped back to their countries. And the ethical problem there is what happens to the food for the local people. They work, they get maybe some money, but the food goes somewhere else. And that is a really problematic aspect, how these deals are done. So you have land grabs, but you also have, ideally, you should be trading. So I scratch your back, I give you certain things, but I buy your food, raw materials, something like that. I think globalization was the best we had to do that. The comparative advantage. I have bananas, you don't have bananas, you have coffee, let's trade. That very foundation, unfortunately, is being challenged. And in regard to your question about China, the American foreign minister now, Marco Rubio, has this explicit policy that it's going to now focus on Latin America, the backyard, to combat Chinese influence, not Africa. They've given up on Africa. They're focusing on Latin America. And so that may be one way, to make sure that certain raw materials from Latin America, especially food, will not flow as easily to China. Who knows? I did a lot of studies on famine, and the one way you can really win a war or whatever is to starve your opposition. If you're my enemy and there's no food, I will win. And I think maybe food policy is going to be very crucial going forward, particularly since there's going to be a trade war.
Good morning. I'm Maria Pia Romeo, PhD candidate in philosophy of law. I want to thank you again for your lecture, especially for the point about it's not a win-win, because sometimes we forget that, and it's something that doesn't let us go on because we think we cannot win, so we don't do anything. I go back to the new technologies topic. I'm sorry. I was thinking about smart cities. And how do you think that can be useful for this topic, for these issues, especially in the idea of the data centers pollution, and also in the idea of a city that is not meant anymore for human beings, but for let the instrument communicate between them. How it's suitable, the idea of human beings' progress in these concepts. Thank you.
Super relevant question. I really don't know anything about smart cities. So I'm sure you know much more than me, and I'm not going to be able to come up with a good answer. But I will go back to the argument that I was referring to, the Daron Acemoglu argument, is that we should not build anything that is smart, that is not in the human interest. Right? Why are we building smart things if it's not to help us or to help animals? So anything smart should be in the interest not of machines or for some elites, for the general interest. So if Pisa becomes a smart city, it should be because it wants to regulate or do something about a problem. Is it pollution, controlling the flow of traffic, safety for the Leaning Tower, Pisa? I don't know. It should be something. But there's also the other aspect. Smart can lead to, monitoring and surveillance, which goes back to the other argument about human freedom. Do you want to be surveilled all the time? You're going to visit your wife or your lover or your children or wherever. Your movements are being tracked. And already now there's a lot of concern that our privacy, like whatever you search online, if you search for something, the next few days you're bombarded with the ads on Google, right? So there's this fear that perhaps our privacy is at stake. And that goes back to the argument about human freedoms. So that's the only thing I like to say, that smart cities, anything smart, in our interest. But I think protecting our privacy is going to be a big challenge. Our identity as human beings, our values, how are we going to do that? Because suddenly everybody knows everything about us. And one little glitch and all our information is available, which can be misused too. So I think let's solve problems that we have with smart solutions, but be also aware of the pitfalls, some of the challenges. And I'd like to know more about smart cities. I should do some more work reading. Thank you.
First, thank you again for your presentation. And I would like to point out a recent example of a situation in which the politics and also the law, an episode, are very crucial to me to understanding the sustainability and sustainable development discourse. And it is the recent fires in LA and the rebuilding that will have to take place. And so we know that that kind of lifestyles in that part of the world is one of the less sustainable ever. Like they have single store houses, no public transport, SUVs everywhere, and now they have to rebuild some of that, some of those neighborhoods, and people are trying to think how they should do that. And probably the best way to do that would be to change radically the way in those neighborhoods were built originally. They would need to have more public green spaces, bigger housings for multi-story apartments, that kind of things. But that is basically impossible to do, first of all, for the ideology of lifestyle that it's well eradicated in that society, but also because it poses some very important legal challenges, like who's to buy the land that is private, owned by the people that had their houses there before. So the political and legal process will be very contested and very interesting to see. And that's just my observation. I would like to see your comments.
Thank you very much. Actually, I gave a lecture here 2 nights ago, and I was using that as an example, because we've had friends who've lost houses from the fire in California, and it's a huge problem. But we've lived in California before, and you're right. It's a society that it's lovely to drive in California. The streets are big, the parking spaces are big. We complain about it in Norway. Everything is weird in Europe in terms of driving. Much better in California. But yes, it's a lifestyle. How do you change that lifestyle? So the Biden administration, just to use the EV policy, said, we're going to subsidize electric cars, promote that. Trump has reversed that. So that's not going to happen. But you're raising another important question about the legal process. And I have actually a case from almost my neighborhood, a very good colleague of mine, a political science professor. I remember I mentioned to you the Green Party. One of my former students who was the deputy leader of the Green Party is an MP. They had the bright idea that they would take over certain neighborhoods in Oslo that had single family owned houses, confiscate, expropriate that, and it was not communicated. It was just by accident that my colleague who lived in that area actually found out. Confiscate this and build high rises because these areas were close to transport hubs, train stations. This would be the environmentally conscious thing to do. Build high rises, have power. This led to huge protests. And my political science professor colleague, who is very good in the media, was one of those spearheading the protests, saying, firstly, there was no transparency. You just decided. I just accidentally found out in a local bulletin. So the process was not consultative. As you know, in law, you have to consult. If you don't consult, that's a big problem. And it can't be just imposed from top down. Cut a long story short, huge protest, that whole thing was abandoned. And we were worried that our house, which is also in one of those transport hubs, would be the next. We would lose our gardens. And so that was the Green Party challenging the right to have our own green garden. By the way, a lot of my students like our garden. That's where we have the pizza parties in the summer. So, we would like a trampoline. We don't want a high rise. And that conflicts with what is environmentally good versus our lifestyle. And that is a challenge we are going to face every day now. Whether it is seawater rising in parts, people have to migrate. And I just don't know how I don't know how law and politics whether it's ready to handle these really emerging conflicts that will rise. And just a final thing in terms of moving, Oslo is like not building enough houses. That's actually another reason why one should have high rises rather than having single, But anyway, so I'm sorry, that was a bit of a long and complicated thing. In California, I don't see it changing. Maybe in some parts of Europe that'll change, but there has to be stronger incentives. But most importantly, transparency and consultation, which is absolutely crucial. So hopefully maybe in California, I don't know what's going to happen. Trump says he turned on the tap and now there's a lot of water flowing, but that's an imaginary tap. There was never any tap. And when we've had when we lived in California, we had an outdoor swimming pool. And one way in which we changed our behavior was, the utility bills. We started getting every month in the summer a bill saying you are the worst in your neighborhood. You're ranked the worst because we were using so much water and we did not cover the pool. There was evaporation. Our children take long showers. I don't know, So in the winter, because we were not using the pool, we were the best. I felt happy. Now in Norway, we have an app. After the Ukraine war, we've become much more conscious about energy use. I am looking at that app. And I love it when we are number one of houses of comparable size. So there's like that way of a subtle naming, shaming, awareness that makes us think we have a smart home, I'm saving energy, I'm doing something for the environment. Maybe something like that. Just a utility bill. It all comes down to money, isn't it? It's all about the money. And if we can say, oh, I can save money by charging the car at night or using the dishwasher at certain, let's do it. And that is changing, I think, slowly, at least in Norway.
Hey, wow. Actually, lots of very good questions from the students. So I don't think mine will be on par. So thank you, Dan, for today, and thank you everybody for the discussion. I arrived a little late, so I'm hoping I'm not asking something you mentioned before, but I caught a couple of mentions of the new relationship between the US and Africa. You said about the disappearance of US aid, and now you said, while replying to another question a few minutes ago, the US has given up on Africa. So I would like you to elaborate a little on that. It's something I don't know very well, this area, and why, what are the consequences also for Africa mainly, and the environment perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. Good question. So the thing is, I mentioned that much of the discourse about African development in the West is in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been China is colonizing Africa. It's a new form of colonization that we should combat. And the argument in the West is that China wants African countries, the 54 countries, to become like China, copy their political model. And the poster child is Rwanda. If you've heard of Rwanda, it has a very charismatic president, Paul Kagame. But Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, is the cleanest city in the world, like Singapore. Everything is structured. People wear helmets when they drive their motorcycle. There's a focus on electric cars, and everything is orderly. But this country had a huge, it was a genocide. Millions of people died, and they were able to rebuild. There's a lot of problems with it, but anyway, the narrative of Africa is it's a neo-colonial trend that the West should combat. The Chinese perspective is that they've been there since the 50s building roads and railways. They are building infrastructure, football stadiums, hotels, parliament buildings. They are giving students scholarships to come to China to study. They're telling journalists, come and study freedom of information in China. They're sending judges. So there's been, I said, relational power. China is doing what looks like the right thing. What is Europe doing? Saying, don't come to Schengen. It's difficult to get a Schengen visa. We can't. We'll try and help you there. But we will provide you, this is a European argument, we'll provide you with aid for healthcare. We will provide you with food aid. We will talk about education. We talk about women's empowerment. We'll talk about climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture. Just to simplify this, a lot of Africans believe that Europeans preach, whereas the Chinese are actually rolling up their sleeves and doing it and building it. In Africa, you can touch a building. You can look at the changing scenery because China has built infrastructure. There is a train service from Nairobi to Mombasa that was dangerous to drive. Now you can drive, ride a beautiful train, even though it's not economically viable. But that's another issue. So a lot of Africans are thinking, wow, the Chinese, you're criticizing the Chinese, but they're actually doing something. Well, the Europeans are preaching. And what is America doing? Well, so America says under Biden, we will launch a program that will compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is the infrastructure thing. You also have Belt and Road Initiative projects in Italy, in Greece, etc. Build Back Better World. The European Union said, we have the Global Gateway Project. And both of these projects, this is the important question, rather than saying, we will build infrastructure for you Africans because we have solidarity, we want you to develop. What did they say, the Americans and the European Union? We're doing it not because we love you, we're doing it to combat the rise of China. And then you tell me, is this a diplomatically correct thing to do? If you tell somebody, we're not doing it because of you, we're doing it for somebody else. And this has become the narrative. So I see America losing. In fact, all the op-eds you read in the newspapers now, they're saying the same thing. America's losing its edge. One of the most important American programs was PEPFAR. The presidential program that George Bush Jr. started to combat HIV/AIDS. It was championed by a friend of mine, the late Paul Farmer from Harvard. They've stopped funding. A lot of lives are going to be lost. American aid programs that were building soft power. America has soft power, right? California, Hollywood, music. That is what China does not have. India has soft power. Americans have soft power. By freezing aid to Africa now, cutting off all of this, I think one is just going to have a much more anti-American sentiment. That soft power is going to slowly disappear. I don't know what the plan is. I think making oneself great again should involve cultivating good feelings towards you. And Trump has a totally different way. Imagine what Trump is doing with Denmark, one of its strongest allies. Trump is going to take over Greenland. By the way, I don't quite like the fact that Denmark still controls Greenland. I think Greenland should be independent. And maybe this is a good thing, that maybe Trump's policies will lead to independence of Greenland. But you don't say, I'm going to just forcibly take over something with allies. So soft power is where I think this is good. But also in terms of lives being lost, Alessandro, I'm really worried. It's not like, and what if Africa needs is not handouts. It needs infrastructure. It needs solutions for energy. And China is the only one, unfortunately. India does a little bit in terms of education, but in terms of technology, it's only China. And most ministers tell me in Africa, there's no other alternative. Why are you just bad-mouthing China? We don't think China is perfect, but show us the alternative. Europeans don't have an alternative for infrastructure. Americans have they've left Africa. And that is really concerning. If you have 600 million people still without access to modern energy, can you imagine? Can you imagine the frustration that is just growing? And here you have people saying, climate change, reduce your emissions. Africa accounts for 3% of climate emissions, 3%, that whole continent. We all should be changing before we preach Africa. That's not happening. You're all exhausted now. You're ready for a proper Italian lunch.
So I think questions are finished, and I thank you, Dan, very much again for giving this stimulating lecture. I'm sure that all of us appreciated it very much. So thank you very much for being here today. And So see you for the next Circle U appointment will be in May when we will host Professor Lars Johansen for a seminar. Yeah, some students have already met him in the past, so he will be back. Okay, so goodbye. Thank you. Thank you, Lars, again.